Welcome to the finish line with Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and the last thing we do on a quilt is put binding on. Now, I love to sit down and do the hand binding. It's sort of like the ending of a really good book for me, but there are times that I need to get that binding done quickly, and then I need to take it to the sewing machine. So I'm going to show you how I machine stitch my binding on, so it goes together a lot faster than the hand sewing. The quilt is all quilted and ready for binding. There are two things that I like to do to the quilt before I even put binding on it. The first thing is run a very small stitch right along this edge. It has to be within a 1/4 inch. That's keeping the layers together so it doesn't shift when I do put the binding on. And it also anchors any of these threads that have come off of my quilt. The next thing is I press the edge where the binding is going to go. That pressing compresses that batting, so it's going to be easy to stitch on and it's going to be easy to turn over because I've taken that puffiness out. The puffiness will come back as it sits there, so I'm not worried about it. I do like to cut my binding at 2 1/4 of an inch. I do sew my strips together on the angle, so that gives me a nice soft seam, and I press with those wrong sides together so that I have a nice edge to work with. When I go to the machine, I'm going to start with my binding folded and then folded one more time in the corner. So I want a 45-degree corner. So I'm going to take that and press and then trim off somewhere around a 1/4 inch. So I'll do this right at my very first pressing and then press it over. When I do that, it gives me a really nice edge to start with. After I've had that cut off, I just like to put a little bit of washable glue just to hold it down. And that way it just stays in place. So it gives me a nice edge to start with. So I'm going to start with this and I'm going to end with my binding coming in between these layers. If I was to hand stitch this, I would stitch my binding on the front of the quilt, and then that binding would turn over and I would hand stitch along the back. But because I am going to machine stitch this down, instead of hand stitching it, I'm going to be stitching from the back side. So let's get this to the machine and I'll show you how I'm going to get it done. The first row of stitching, I'm going to be stitching the raw edge along this edge of the quilt. On my Bernina, I do have a dual feed, so I will be using that. And that 1/4 inch foot. I'm going to start stitching my binding down off of this little point, come on and go over top. This little section I want to do less than a 1/4 inch. So in my case, I can just move my needle over and still use the edge of my foot as a guide. So I can start stitching and then just slide this right up. You can always pin if you'd like, and then stitch until I come back past this little point. Once I've come past that point, I'm going to set the machine for a true 1/4 inch. And I'm going to stitch that binding on all the way, and I am stitching it onto the back side. When I come to one of these corners, I'm going to stitch and stop a 1/4 inch from this corner. And I can use that mark on my foot right here to get to that 1/4 inch. So that 1/4 inch matches the edge. And then just turn and stitch off somewhat like a 45-degree angle, and it doesn't have to be exact. Now I don't cut my threads, but I do lift up, pull that quilt out, and then go to turn my corner. So I still have my thread right here. To turn the corner, I'm going to fold this edge up. So the edge of the quilt and the edge of that binding are going to match. and then fold it back down. This fold matches that top of the quilt. The raw edges now match that other side. And I have these thread tails to give myself a little boost if I need it. So I'm going to place that needle down and the foot down right on that edge and start stitching. Depending on how thick your quilt is and your machine, a lot of people say that they get hung up here, that the foot can't go over that hump. That's where this little handle or this little thread comes in handy. So you can just hold it, give it a little bit of tension, and help pull this quilt through that foot. Now, if your machine's not having problems getting over the corner, you won't need that. And continue stitching. And you can see that little piece was a nice little handle if I needed it. I've gone all the way around and I'm now at the beginning. This is the little area that I did a scant 1/4 inch. But when I finish sewing the binding down, it's going to come lining up with the 1/4 inch. So I need to take this piece and stick it into this hole. So I'm going to cut an angle on this binding. You can see that I just have that little cut. It covers this edge and it's going to be able to go up inside. And just so it doesn't move, just add a little bit of glue, push that up, smooth this over. Now I'm going to continue that 1/4 inch until I come to my 1/4 inch seam. Now I can lift up my needle and take my binding out. So here's the beginning and the end. I take a little bit of thread from the top of my machine because I'm going to use that to stitch and trim off the bottom. So I have my thread. I don't have to knot it. I'm going to pull that thread right here to the starting point just by slipping it underneath. Now I'm going to do a little stitch and stitch this side. And then when I get to the top, I'll attach those 2 layers together, turn it over, and just hand stitch this little opening down. Once that's done, I'm going to take this to the iron and press. I'm not worried about pressing this corner. I just want to press this down so I have a nice straight edge. I will be stitching this binding now from the front side. So this is just going to come over and I'm going to be able to stitch it down. There are 2 different feet that I like to use to stitch down my quilts. For the Bernina, my 10D is a edge stitch foot and it has that little bar down the center. Or I'll use a blind stitch foot, but it also has that bar. So when this binding gets turned over and I'm stitching, I'm not stitching with that edge along that binding. I'm stitching with it along that back seam. So it's going to run along this stitch. That will run right along that edge. I will adjust the needle to go along the side, but I want the bar to be going right along the edge here. That bar helps keep my foot straight. So as I'm stitching, my foot is not going to veer off. It's going to stay right in that ditch underneath. I'm going to start with 1 pin just to hold that binding over for me, but I'll start stitching in front of it. So I'm going to put that foot down until I feel that little ledge underneath. Once I'm in that groove, I'm going to be able to move my needle. So the bar is keeping my foot straight, running along this edge, and my stitches are going to go right along this edge. And I find a stiletto is a good thing to use just so that we can hold this over. But of course, you could pin it if you're more comfortable. So that edge is following underneath. And I have that nice stitch coming off of the back. When I come to the corner, I'm going to fold this edge over first, tuck in all of those threads. I'm going to put one pin to hold that binding down for me, and that second pin is right along this edge. Now when this comes over, it's going to give me a nice 45-degree angle. Make sure everything is straight and continue stitching. I'm going to stop at that 45-degree angle and pivot. So that bar is still right along that edge. That pin was just to hold things for me, and I can continue. And there is that beautiful mitered corner. So just to recap this corner, this is the area I'm going to be stitching down. Fold that seam over, put that one pin just to hold that binding over, and that second pin is running right along this edge. So this pin is going to help that 45-degree angle, because when this comes over, it's going to give you that 45-degree angle. So I've gone all the way around. This is where I've started. I could take that pin out and just continue stitching. I just love how that little edge runs right along the back. So this is where I started it and ended. Here's the corner. And when we look at the back, we have a little row of stitching all the way along that edge. And that's because that little bar followed right in that area. You can see that little stitch line on the back of the quilt, but I don't mind that. And if your binding and thread and backing were the same, you would never see it at all. Now you could switch this up. If you don't like the stitching on the binding, you can do it reversed. But I don't mind looking at that little row of stitching right along the edge of that binding. It's a good strong way of doing the binding. It's also very quick. A few things to remember is press your quilt first, press your binding, and then repress that binding going out. And it's just easier to pull it over. And between a stiletto and the foot with a little bar in it, that's going to stitch nice and easy for you. Thank you for joining me today on the Finish Line. Feel free to subscribe. I'm on Facebook, Instagram. I do have a newsletter, all under So Very Easy. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now.